Good morning, everybody. Are you ready for the fourth episode of the story of Esther? This plot has been hatched in Babylon by Haman, a real baddie, to eliminate every single Jew in the Babylonian Empire. It was going to happen on the 7th of March. Esther is alerted as to this plot, Queen Esther, and she takes her life in her hand and walks in, uninvited, into the presence of King Xerxes, her husband. Sounds strange, but that was the custom of his day. And Xerxes says, "What would you like me to do for you? Make any request, up to half of this empire, and it will be granted to you." Now, Esther thinks for a moment and she says, "Your lord, or my lord, will you organize a banquet at which 3 people will be present? You, me, and Haman. Just the 3 of us." Well, the king thinks, well, that's quite easy to arrange. And so a banquet is put in place and the 3 of them dine together. And the king then says to his wife Esther, the queen, "You didn't really ask much of me. Please make another request." And Esther thinks for a moment and says, "My lord, can we have a second banquet with just 3 of us present? You, my lord, Haman, and myself." The king says, well, that's very easy to arrange. And so the second banquet is organized. In the meantime, Haman goes home, boasts to his wife and to the friends that he has had dinner with the king and that he has been invited by the queen to go and dine with her also in the presence of the king. And he really is pushing this incredible honor in the faces of everybody else. And while they're talking, his wife says, "Oh, by the way, you said you were going to eliminate Mordecai. Now, why don't you build gallows in preparation for that execution? Remember, the edict's still in place, hasn't been revoked. The Jews are going to be taken out on the 7th of March. And Mordecai says, "Yeah, okay, let's build those gallows and we'll bring Mordecai and we will hang him high." And then Haman realizes, you can't just take somebody off the streets and summarily execute them. You've got to get permission. And I've got to get permission from King Xerxes. So Haman decides that in the morning he will go and knock on the palace door and ask the king for permission to kill Mordecai. That very night, the king cannot sleep. He is troubled. He doesn't know what is troubling him. So he wakes up, as many of us do, and he gets a book. And he begins to read the book. And in this book, he begins to read the history of what had gone on in the years up until that point. The very book in which the story of Mordecai's exposing of the plot to assassinate him had been written down. So the king is reading this book, and he reads there the story of Mordecai. He'd kind of like forgotten. That's Queen Esther's uncle, her adopted father. And he scratches his head and he thinks, I wonder if Mordecai has been rewarded. Now it's about waking up time and the palace is getting going, and there's a knock on the door and somebody comes into the king and says, Haman has come to talk to you. Now Haman has come to get permission to kill Mordecai. And before Haman has a chance to open his mouth, the king says to him, "Haman, I've just got a question to ask you. I've just been reading this story, It's an amazing story. What would you give as a reward to somebody who'd saved my life, who'd served me honorably? And Haman thinks the king is talking about him, Haman, when all the while the king is thinking about Mordecai. So Haman really lays it on. He says, you know what? I'd give him a procession. I would bestow upon him every honor, every gift in the realm. And the king says, thank you. That's what I do. Haman thinks he's now going to get it all. And then the king says to Haman, well, the guy I'm thinking of is Mordecai. Haman's heart virtually stops beating because he's come to ask the king for permission to kill Mordecai. And the king says to Haman, you go and you organize a procession and you make sure that he is one of the most honored men in this nation. Well, Haman is humiliated. You can understand that, as is his wife and family. But remember two things. The edict to kill all the Jews has not yet been revoked. And secondly, Haman has an appointment with the queen at a second banquet. Well, the night of the second banquet arrives. Haman is ushered in, and the king and the queen sit down with him. And during the course of the banquet, the king says to Esther, Esther, you still have not asked really me for anything of note. I've offered you half of this realm, and all you have said, may I have a banquet feast with Haman. There must be something more. And then comes the moment. Then comes the moment when Esther strikes. She's got Haman in front of her, the man who has plotted not only against Mordecai, but against the Jews. And she says, my lord, there is someone in this land who has plotted to destroy every Jew in your kingdom. And the king says, who? And Esther moves her eyes across to Haman and points at him. And she says, there he is. Well, you can imagine the reaction. The king is shocked. The king is shocked. He gets up in a rage. He goes and stands outside. Haman knows that he has been exposed. He knows he is guilty. He knows that it's going to be his death sentence. And he begs and he pleads. Esther is sitting on a couch and he jumps on her to beg her to forgive him. The king walks in and thinks Haman is sexually assaulting his wife, the queen. He shouts and screams, and the soldiers come in and they take Haman out. And he is executed. And all his wealth and all his seniority is given over to Mordecai. Yeah. It's a gripping story. And it is not finished as yet. What do we learn here? Well, it's this thread of God's purposes that somehow at times seems quite obvious, and then that thread disappears and you're not quite sure what is going on. A Jewish orphan, a Jewish woman is brought to this position as Queen of Babylon. Why? How does it all work? It's untidy at points in terms of some of the morality, but through it all, the hand of God is at work, because he wants his Esther to be at the right position at the right time in order to be able to save his people in Babylon. Let me say it again. God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. I'll see you tomorrow.